How y'all doing? I'm happy to say that Design Workshop has just opened an office in Chicago, so we are at last Midwesterners, although you may detect from me an accent that is distinctly not from the Midwest. How many of y'all speak German? Okay. I will probably pronounce a few German words today. It won't sound like German. So I'm going to ask you in advance to forgive me for that, if you will. In 1976, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from Harvard on the Bayou, sometimes referred to as Louisiana State University. I had, it was the middle of a recession. I was fortunate to actually find employment in Fort Worth, Texas, working for the Parks Department. And if you've been to Fort Worth, it has a rather remarkable park system and, in fact, a rather remarkable set of cultural institutions. And I was really interested in how did this park system come about, right? Where did it come from? And in the park system file drawers, there were all of these drawings from a Kansas City landscape architecture firm called Hare and Hare. You may have heard of them if you're a landscape architect. They followed George Kessler through most of the cities of the Midwest and the country and Southwest after Kessler's death. And then I came across the name of George Kessler. So doing what a good student did, I went to a book called Design on the Land, which is how they taught landscape history when I was at LSU. And I turned to the index and I came across two references to George Kessler, one Roland Park in Baltimore, Maryland, the other brief mention to the Kansas City Park System. So I wrote Norman Newton at Harvard, who had written the book, and I still have his response to this day. Clearly, Mr. Culbertson, Mr. Kessler was not a landscape architect of great significance, or he would have received more mention in my book. I'm here to tell you, Norman was wrong. Way wrong. My wife is a little bit flummoxed, confused about my morbid fascination, as she likes to call it, with old, dead landscape architects. But I think I come from it nobly. This was a very moving year for the Culbertson clan, the Lyles clan from Cheneyville, Louisiana. My mother's oldest sister, when she was 14, was given a book by a farm owner in Cheneyville. She read it. It became the subject of her master's thesis at LSU, her life work. This year, her edited copy of that book was made into a movie called 12 Years a Slave. So the Lyles like old stuff, and I'm proud to say I'm a Lyles. So what I want to talk to you about is the significance of something you have in here in Indianapolis. It is a national, if not global treasure, okay? We are, first time I've been in this building, in a remarkable building that has been beautifully restored. So I don't know who of you are responsible, maybe all of you, but give yourself a hand. There are 88,000 plus entries in the National Register of Historic Places. Less than 3,000 of those are landscapes. And I hope that's a little bit of why we're here today. And I want to talk to you about the fact, and I ponder, when you spend a lot of time worrying about history, what's the relevance of it? Why is this important? And I'd like to take a few moments and talk about the fact that the past, why that popped up there, the past is a guide to the future. Is that working? It's not turning forward, though. Is it? Oh, maybe if I turn it on. What do you think? Okay, I'm going to use my finger. This is what I'd like to talk to you about today. First of all, I want to talk about George Kessler's early life and education. It's really important, I believe, for you to understand what preceded the Indianapolis Park System, why it was formed the way it was formed, why it looks the way it works, why it is indeed a work of art. And it is a work of art, okay? I want you to understand a little bit about some of the research I've been doing subsequent to my work on Kessler, which is the work of German-American landscape architects and gardeners. Some of you are German. This is, in many ways, a German town, and that's part of the story. I want to talk a little bit about the motivation of why these grand park and boulevards were developed in this period of time, the evolution of Kessler's career and how it impacted his work in Indianapolis, the origins and the form of the Indianapolis park system, and then the importance of its legacy and why it truly is a guide to the future of this city. This is George Edward Kessler at a young age. I've begun to wonder, having researched his life and work for, 40-something years, I think I'm starting to look a little like him. It's kind of like someone and their dog, I think. So, well, I always wonder if I just shaved it back to a mustache, how eerie would that be, right? Part my hair down the middle. But George was born July 16th, 1862, in that spot with the blue circle around it. Bad Frankenhausen, and what we would know is East Germany, near the great towns of Weimar and Erfurt, near Leipzig, right? Small agricultural town, right? And he was brought by his mother at a very young age, about 3, to Dallas, Texas. You can imagine Dallas, Texas in 1865, out on the raw prairie, dusty dirt streets, quite a transformation from Europe, right? And at about 1878, his mother took him back to Germany for his education. Quite important, right? Particularly important if, as his mother said, he had a great sense of the artistic, a great love of plants, a great love for nature. Why was that important? The first American school of landscape architecture was founded in 1899 at Harvard, right? The first school of landscape architecture in Germany was founded by this fellow, Peter Joseph Linné, in 1823. A little bit earlier than we got to it here in the United States. There was a very formalized system of apprenticeships, of Hofgardeners, house gardeners, castle gardeners, of garden inspectors, people who managed these grand sloshes, these castles in the German countryside, and there was a formal process of apprenticing with these individuals. Linné, if you've ever had a chance to travel through Germany and see the great parks, was a phenomenal designer, and he was particularly gifted because he had the ability to weave very naturalistic forms together with very formal elements, if that sounds familiar to you here in Indianapolis. Linné designed the great boulevard in Berlin, Unter den Linden, right? A boulevard that Kessler had the chance to see and to begin to understand the ability of boulevards to form and give character to cities. Those boulevards to this day are why we all pay large quantities of money to go on vacation in Europe, all right? So those are the places that draw people. Those are the beautiful places that cause people to want to visit a city, to linger, to enjoy the public realm, to talk to their fellow citizens. Those boulevards are more than for the movement of automobiles. They're for the movements of people and bicycles and baby prams and so forth. Kessler had a chance to study here at the school that Linné created, the Gardner Lehranstalt, right? The School for Landscape Architecture, if you will, at the time, although that term was not coined until much later here in the United States by Olmsted. He had a chance to sit with masters, work in gardens, study for a while at the Schlosspark Belvedere that you see here, or at Goethe's Park on der Elm in Weimar, wonderful park along the floodplain of the Ilm River. Sounds familiar. keeping the river corridors and stream corridors as parks and open space, and keeping along them those magical historical structures. In this case, Friedrich List House was in Goethe's Park. So this was the landscape that that Kessler was schooled in. He also studied here at the Sanssouci Palace outside Berlin and Potsdam, and in these gardens, the grand formal gardens of Europe. Now imagine when he came back to the United States about 1861, he had seen some amazing things, right? Park Muskau, which I'll talk about, that was designed by this fellow that you see here, the Park an der Elm, Unter der Linden, the Tiergarten, the zoo, if you will, in Berlin, the Volksgarten, the People's Garden, right? And other variations, the Englischer Garden in Munich, right? This park, Park Muskau, right on the German-Polish border that Muskau had created, kept these wonderful streams with a series of carriage trails that provided an endless variety of circuits and movements through the German countryside, opening views of closed copse of trees, opening to a meadow, every turn of a roadway and pathway aligned to create a distant view, right? Magical landscape embellished with beautiful bridges, classical bridges that covered the countryside. The damming of streams to create small bodies of water. These are the roots of the Indianapolis park system. Now, it's very common in the United States, and certainly for the 36 years or so I've been in practice, to refer to anything that is green and big and park-like in the United States as Olmstedian, right? Ever heard that term? Olmsted must have done it. There's a park. It must have been an Olmsted Park, right? They're all Olmsted parks, right? But there's really a big difference, right? Because the Germans used very liberal use of architecture. First, von Muskau preserved all the old villages and historic structures within his family estate and parkland. The Germans believed in active recreation, and we'll talk about that in a minute and how it influenced some of the design of some of the parks in Indianapolis. They believed in arts and entertainment. You could go to a park and you could listen to opera and theater and circus acts and all kinds of crazy fun things with your family together, right? Something that the Puritans of New England did not find so cool, right? That was not the way they rolled up there in Boston, right? It had to be beautiful, it had to be serene, didn't like a lot of activities, but those Germans kind of got a little rowdy for them, right? And there are many stories, if you read the history of parks in New York City, where English officials, police officials would be concerned about near riots by the Germans in the parks, And so they were just out there having a good old time. And the Germans liberally ornamented their parks with sculpture, right? And ironically, when Olmsted designed Central Park, there were no sculptures. The Germans got even. I've heard the tale of the first sculpture installed in Central Park was of Goethe. So thought it was a nice move, right? And the Germans believed in these grand horticultural displays and this liberal use of color and detailed planting. So very different kind of design styles that are rather important to consider. They also had a very different view, cultural view of open space. It was a very democratic view, the Volksgarten, right, that I mentioned earlier in Berlin, that it was family-based, that you brought everybody out, that there was music and theater in the parks, and most importantly, there was beer. Right? Beer is good, right? Beer was liberally used in the German parks, and that's an important thing. And indeed, many of the parks we have in the United States, in Cleveland and Milwaukee, and I believe Indianapolis, I have a long inventory of them, were at one time German beer gardens. And when Prohibition rolled around, they got rid of the beer. Property owner didn't know what to do with the park land that they had created. It became a public park. And at the same time, they believed in civility. So you have this contrast in this question, and it's interesting when we were talking a moment about John Charles Olmsted, and Eliot coming to Indianapolis and developing a park plan. What truly are the roots? What are the attribution? The fact that the creation of park systems are really a layering of a lot of ideas and principles by a lot of generations, and they evolve over time. And I want to talk a moment about the importance of tasteful and gracious evolution, right? The interesting part about Olmsted is Olmsted's favorite book, quote, favorite book next to the Bible, he kept it by his bed his entire life, was a book called On Solitude by the German philosopher Friedrich Zimmermann. So the roots of Olmsted's park designs were based in the German theories that also, by the way, influenced the American transcendentalists, that also influenced his own thinking about how nature and relaxation and about being in nature, particularly in an urbanizing environment, can really calm the spirit and soothe the soul. Fundamental principles that Olmsted believed in that came from the Germans. He took his design precedents from Muskau, just as Kessler has done, and interestingly enough, as suggested by the book that you see here, their Central Park in New York, he borrowed talent, trained talent, from Germany. The superintendent of the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago was a German. The superintendent of the Boston Park System, when he implemented the Emerald Necklace and so forth, was a German. The same with Prospect Park and in Brooklyn, Stanford University. Olmsted's work was largely implemented. The technical knowledge, the trained landscape architects were German, right? So now imagine a young guy just spent, about 8 years in Germany, working at the Sanssouci Palace, hanging out on the Unter den Linden in Berlin, and he gets shipped here, Kansas City, Missouri. It's a raw town on the Kaw River, barely moving, right? Barely forming. Young guy that you see in the lower right-hand corner was recommended, not sent by Olmsted, to one of his clients, the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf Railroad, to create a railroad park. Here in Indianapolis, many cities, the streetcar lines created parks distant from the city, and it became a reason for someone to get on the streetcar and ride out to the suburbs. You paid a dime or nickel, or I don't know what the currency was at that point in time, take the family out, go see the bear cage, go see the zoo, go see all of those kinds of amusements that you can find, have a Sunday of recreation, take the streetcar back. Parks became a commercial activity. And that question of parks as a commercial activity, that's something that Kessler learned well. He, because of that, became involved with the business community in Kansas City, creating grand residential neighborhoods like you see here in Hyde Park. And in 1892, he created this plan for Kansas City. It's interesting in principle in 92, 93 that there are a series of parks in each quadrant of the city. Sound familiar? Each quadrant of the city connected as a continuous system, just as Muskau had done in Germany, with a series of boulevards that allow someone to move continuously through the city with open space, right? The clever part about the Kansas City system, which is interesting when you talk about John Earnshaw or the Olmsteds and why their plans weren't adopted, is they developed a system in Kansas City of taxing the land or assessing the land adjacent to the park systems to pay for the construction of parks. Kessler understood how to be a close friend of the newspaper publishers, of the business leaders in the community, of joining the commercial clubs and so forth, understood how to get these things financed, and that became the way, much of the way, that he became effective. Grand boulevards like Gillum Parkway, transforming slums on the North Terrace into North Terrace, now Kessler Park in Kansas City, and these grand European images brought to the raw areas of the United States. The Paseo, his grand boulevard, that rich German planting design, the tapas gardenerie, carpet gardening, as they called it, in that period of time, and he became a close personal friend with J.C. Nichols, who built the great Country Club District, one of the great residential neighborhoods in the United States, and the Country Club Plaza. And over his entire life, through the ups and downs in politics, they expanded the system throughout time where it moved in concert with the expanding city. 1904, he had a chance to do a plan for Memphis, Overton Park, and the Kansas City work and the Memphis work brought the attention of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, and that truly brought Kessler a national presence, right? 1904 was a significant year, not only because of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and Kessler's work there. It was also the year that Edith Wharton published a book entitled Italian Villas and Their Gardens, right? So at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, as there would be in Terre Haute and Fort Wayne, South Bend, other cities, Garfield Park, there would be a southern sunken garden built upon those fashionable principles that Edith Wharton had written about. So again, European roots brought together. Kessler worked with some of the best architects in the United States and throughout the region to transform the River des Peres, moving trees, creating an amazing landscape in the midst of what is now Forest Park, and then transforming that park at the close of the World's Fair into a new park. Now, why were people so interested in creating World's Fairs and creating these grand park and boulevard systems? One, you'll recall that image of Kansas City and that raw bluff overlooking the landscape. These were pretty rough spots, right? This was a new country. This was not a country that had the grand cathedrals and monuments and palaces of Europe, right? We didn't have those things. And yet, post-Civil War, we had a burgeoning economy. We were becoming a world leader, right? Richard Guy Williams, an historian at the University of Virginia, calls this the American Renaissance. And it was because we perceived of it as a renaissance was another reason that we looked to Europe for our models, right? We were entrepreneurs, we were capitalists, we were competitive. Kansas City had to outdo St. Louis. St. Louis had to outdo Indianapolis. Indianapolis had to outdo Cincinnati. Everybody need the biggest ball of string, right? You got to have something that everybody wants to come and see. You were competing, right? You were trying to create civility out of a raw landscape, right? You needed these elements to create a civic place, a democratic place, a place that people wanted to live, right? Now, Indianapolis has been remarkable in the fact that this Kessler system has been entered on the National Register of Historic Places. I had a chance to review again that nomination process, and I'd like to make one correction, if I would, to that document. It's oftentimes said that Kessler worked alone. And having practiced for 36 years and having a firm of over 100 people, this question of attribution becomes very important, right? As one said, wow, Edison created all of these inventions, right? He did them all himself. He thought of himself, right? Yeah, he and another 100 engineers that happened to work in the studio who all remain unnamed, right? So Kessler had this fellow that worked for him, Henry Wright. Henry Wright was from St. Louis, actually he's from Lawrence, Kansas, I believe, educated at Penn, trained as an architect, became a landscape architect, worked with Kessler for much of his career until he started his own firm called Wright & Stein that designed a very famous project called Radburn, New Jersey, that you may have heard of. He also had a young lady, very unusual, named Etta Sudemeister. Etta graduated from high school in Kansas City. She stayed with George until the very end as his trusted assistant. George credited her with the planting design for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. She clearly worked on all of the projects in Indianapolis, I believe. And I also believe that she just may, have been the first professionally trained woman landscape architect in the United States. So, and she's kind of cute, I think. So, but she was apparently really brilliant. And the question, it's an interesting question about the fact that people say he had a one-person office. It wasn't really a one-person office, but there were at most 4 or 5 people at any one point in time. There was no computer-aided drafting and design. They drew all of this stuff by hand. And yet you look at 26 major park system master plans and major parks throughout the country and so forth. It's a remarkable amount of output in a really short career, right? The other thing that happened around 1904, which is really quite sad, is George's wife had tuberculosis, and she entered a sanitarium in Green Bay where she stayed for the remainder of her life. And I believe that that was a rather pivotal moment in his life because he immersed himself in his work. He traveled constantly. It was said that he traveled 250,000 miles a year by train. Now, I do that by airplane, okay? That's crazy to begin with, right? By train is unbelievable, right? The other thing that's important to consider when you think about why the importance of park and boulevard systems, okay? Got zoning in Indianapolis? You like it, you don't like it? We won't talk about whether you like it or not, right? When was zoning created as a legal construct in the United States? Anybody know? Ambler Realty versus Euclid, Ohio, the U.S. Supreme Court's case, 1926. Okay? So if you were a landscape architect, there really was no such thing as a city planner in that day. The only way that you had to shape the character of a city was with parks and boulevards. It was the one tool, one of the few tools that you had available to you, right? Because the legal mechanisms that we consider today to give shape and character to a city are no longer around. In Cincinnati, Kessler considered a park and boulevard system that literally contained the entire city to shape the city. He thought about how industrial uses bordered the floodplains, how residential areas bordered the hilltops. He thought about how those things worked in section and parkways would circulate and connect those things together. High point parks, like you see here at Eden Park. And yet, unlike Indianapolis, Cincinnati, God bless them, has really not, as much as they've tried, maintained that vision. You can see a great park like this fallen in disrepair, perhaps like the Taggart Memorial that we just talked about. The importance of really recognizing the true value of what you have and being willing to invest to maintain it for many reasons, which we'll talk about in a moment. So right around 1908, right? You've seen that background, the education in Germany. George comes to this place, Indianapolis, right? He comes following Earnshaw. He comes following Olmsted. The fact that there have been two largely unsuccessful attempts to build a park system in the city, although there has been mentioned, there has been parkland acquired, a major important step, and he creates a rather extraordinary plan. And it works, right? I sometimes tell the young staff in my office, great ideas are really important, but at the end of the day, it matters whether you're effective, right? Can you convince people to do and implement those projects? George was a great landscape architect. He was truly an artist, but he was also a businessman. And in the age of the American Renaissance, he understood the business community. He knew how to speak their language. He knew how to explain to them that parks and boulevards have phenomenal economic value. So if I'm in Indianapolis and I'm trying to convince the people of this city that they should repair and preserve and protect the parks and monuments of this system, I can do it based on principles of art. And I like to say, the arrow's in your quiver. I would urge you to use that arrow if it works. They have great environmental value. I urge you to use that arrow, but do it because it makes sound business sense. George knew that. George knew it had a profound economic impact on the community, and it more than paid for itself. That's the one reason, and it's a critical reason, to have a park and boulevard system. He imagined in Indianapolis a perfect city, right? Open space as flood protection. As was described in many of these cities, the idea that the boulevards oftentimes bordered both of the rivers and streams. They were elevated. They contained the floodplain. They created means of circulation. They created means of transport, but they also created flood protection for the adjacent neighborhoods. The property owners, by the way, and you can argue the pros and cons of this, were encouraged, perhaps gained more developable land. The economic health of the city was largely enabled by these kinds of strategies. As you saw in Kansas City, the idea that there are political benefits, economic benefits, recreational benefits for parks in the quadrants of the city, be it Riverside Park or Garfield or Willard and so forth. As you saw at Park Muskau in Germany, the idea that these stream corridors are protected as open space, the river corridors are protected as open space, and as First von Muskau had done, the idea that all of these roads and paths and connections become circuits through the woods, circuits through nature, and there's a hierarchy of parks in terms of their intent and use, from the formality that you find in Garfield Park, right, to the naturalness of Riverside, nature, the focus of Riverside, as Kessler called it. The idea that these parkways linked those systems together, and as Peter Joseph Linné had done, there were grand moves of nature, of naturalistic forms, and formal elements that one might find in Europe. It was a system that grew remarkably fast, an update almost every year for 4 or 5 or 6 years, because the population, I think when George started here, was about 102,000. Within about 4 years, it was about 190,000. So people were oozing all over the place, all over the landscape. George was trying, in the absence of other urban design tools, other planning tools, to use the park system as a way to shape the city, right? Believing that it added real estate and value to the place. The creation of grand parks like Garfield, channeling perhaps Edith Wharton, the sketch that you find in the Kessler collection for the Sunken Garden, and the creation using that grand horticultural display, that German bold use of color, the creation of the Sunken Gardens at Garfield Park, right? The converse of that, formal played against the naturalistic forms of Riverside Park, preserving the landscape of creating recreation and flood control, and believing also in parks and open space as a sanitary tool in an increasingly industrialized and urbanized city. An important question. Now, this is a question that's also a German turn, right, that differs from the Olmstedian point of view. The Germans were fierce believers in education. A few words that we have now incorporated in our own vocabulary. The kindergarten, the garden for children. The gymnasium, the Turnverein. Had those in Indianapolis, right? Because the Germans were the first to pioneer the idea of recreation within public parks, right? The idea that they weren't only these pastoral parks, but they were also the kinds of places that were reflected in the Willard Park Master Plan. There's some very interesting plans to me in this period of time, right? You have these elements of sort of classical axial relationships of buildings and walkways and so forth, and then you got a track right next to it, or a play tennis court right next to it. A difficult time at times for park and recreation, because there were new demands on the park system that were caused by this increasing emphasis in public health and recreation, right? It's an important thing to remember. Some people say that the city beautiful that was referenced earlier was followed by what was called the city practical, right? The progressive movement tried to believe in practical cities. The idea that the city beautiful, while grand, did not solve every problem. You can go adjacent to the Paseo in Kansas City today, as you can in parks of the Indianapolis park system, and find poverty. You can find unemployment. You can find rundown neighborhoods. So the park system didn't solve every problem. And so Kessler was always trying to provide multiple benefits from the system. Beauty, flood control, sanitation, recreation, public health, the tranquility of nature, many, many layers, not to mention economic development, a critical part of the equation. The work in Indianapolis was paralleled in the great Denver system, where Kessler used parks and boulevards, like you see here in City Park, to capture distant views of the Colorado Mountains, or his old hometown of Dallas, where he proposed a very radical idea to create within the Trinity River what he called Town Lake. Town Lake, 1911, Dallas, Texas. Town Lake, 100 years later, they built it, right? I had a chance to speak in South Bend a while ago on the 100th anniversary of the Kessler Park system there. They took me out before the lecture and says, "We have a trail we have to show you." I said, "Oh, okay, I'll go see the trail. What's it all about?" George had drawn it on a plan 100 years before, and they had built it that year, 100 years later. I like to say in the office, great ideas get legs. And they may not happen right away, but they last forever, right? So when you think about the Kessler plan for Indianapolis, there are great ideas there. Some of them may never have been realized. Some of them may have been realized and lost, but they are enduring prospects that are still worthy of implementation and consideration. World War I rolled around. George Kessler and many landscape architects were enlisted in the aid of their country, planning military cantonments, planning munitions factories. George been drinking a little bit of that German beer in the lower right-hand corner, getting a little misshapen like me. But he's out, and this is interesting, right? The German aiding his new country in a war against Germany, right? Interesting notion, right? He traveled around the countryside. He was planning and managing more military cantonments than any of the other landscape architects and architects were involved. They said that he gave 100,000 francs to the American hospital in Neuilly, France, right? Here was someone who apparently spoke with a strong German accent that felt his entire life motivated to prove that he was an American, right? Now, if you've watched Tina in the video about the Kessler Park system, she makes reference to the fact that when the American Society of Landscape Architects was formed in 1899, George Kessler was not invited to participate. Now, this is a guy who had just created the Kansas City Park system, who had done major park improvements around the country, who was really on a roll. And when they all got together in Boston, no letter for George. How does the guy not get invited? They said he was more of an engineer than a landscape architect, or more of a superintendent was actually what the letter said. He was skilled in management and not just in art. But curiously, they also didn't invite Theodore Wirth, who managed the park system in Hartford, or Edward Sfagerl, who managed the park system in Seattle. There was clearly this notion that the English made the decisions and the Germans were immigrants that were not worthy of their consideration. Other park systems followed in Fort Wayne, South Bend, Terre Haute, master plans for Rose Polytechnic, for Indiana University, for a number of parks and boulevards. Here in Indianapolis, as this program of city planning evolved, Kessler was called upon, as buildings began to rise around the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, to establish a set of guidelines to establish the height of those buildings. You'll notice there's a neat little buzz cut right around that circle that says, let's celebrate this monument in the heart of our city and don't allow high rises to come up around it. Probably a battle that still gets fought yet to this day. But Kessler set those standards, I believe, about 1921. In the later years, Herman Park in Houston, the University of Nanking, one of the great universities in China to this day. I visited the campus. Shanghai College of Science and Technology. I was asked earlier today, he designed a residential subdivision in Mexico City called Chapultepec Heights. Travel was by train, and he was working all over the world. Pretty remarkable fellow that brought you this park system in Kansas City, the gateway crossing to El Paso. A remarkable career, cut tragically short, March 20th, 1923. George Kessler came under the care of Dr. Jameson in Indianapolis, Indiana, expecting to have what should have been a minor surgery, and passed away after a brief illness. Now, it's difficult to know why he passed away under those conditions. You know, he wanted to be treated by his dear friend. He wanted to be in a city he loved. He wanted to know where people cared for him and would take care of him, right? Now, my theory, someone asked him, why did he die so young? It could have been a staph infection. Things happen in hospital, right? It could have been, 41 years of traveling 250,000 miles a year, of transforming all of the great cities of the American Midwest, from Dallas to Fort Worth to Houston to Denver to Salt Lake City to Indianapolis to Cincinnati to Fort Wayne to Terre Haute to Indianapolis. Guy gave his life in pursuit, as many artists do, of his life, of his art, right? This fellow, Lawrence Sheridan, took over from George about 1923. He took the fundamental principles he had learned from Kessler and expanded that vision to include the entire county. Make no small plans, as Edward Burnham said of Chicago. A grand system, an ecosystem scale of planning for Indianapolis, right? Now, these kind of ideas often give trouble to people. Grand bridges and elements that provide that European measure. It's tough to maintain things, to pay to rebuild the Illinois Street Bridge or to restore the trolley stop in Garfield Park. There are still parks that are threatened and endangered and are losing their sense of greatness that they once had, right? So why should you treasure the Kessler legacy? One, be proud. Be proud. Kansas City is working today on listing Kessler's first park system on the National Register. You got it done far, far earlier than any other city where Kessler worked. That is a remarkable accomplishment, and I want you to give yourself a hand. You should feel very good about that, right? Understand and promote the value of open space, right? It's fine to preserve this system because kids can play there. It's fine to preserve the system because it's beautiful. It's fine to preserve it because you can ride your bike and you can recreate, right? But if the people who hold the purse strings don't understand the economic benefits of it, the purse strings are going to remain tight. Preserve this system because it's essential to the economic health of the community. Nothing has really changed in all of these years, right? You are still in a competitive environment, right? You're still competing with all of those same cities and more that you were, almost over 100 years ago, right? Preserve the system, expand it, protect it because it is essential to your competitive advantage, right? Preserve it because the great urban environment is what attracts the creative class. It's essential to the economic health. It's essential to what will keep your kids here and bring their kids back, right? Those are reasons to preserve it. A key one, Kansas City, St. Louis, $2 billion court decrees from each of those cities because of combined sewer systems. Sound familiar? Got one of those here, don't you, right? George did you a favor. What is the rage in landscape architecture these days? Green infrastructure, the idea that you can use native plants and drainage systems to clean and preserve water quality and deal with sanitation issues. Kansas City chose to put that $2 billion into more pipes. Maybe there's another way, a cheaper way, that addresses combined sewer impacts. Your city master plan says there is, and at the same time protects parks and open space, right? Protects those boulevards. The synergism of having parks and open space do multiple things, just the way George planned it, right? Coordinate land use and open space, always a big challenge. Remember, not his fault, but at that point in time, Kessler did not have the ability to manage land use in relationship to the open space planning that he was doing, right? Understanding how those systems work together. And then the big question is adapt, as George would have done, adapt but with a view toward history, right? This is not just open land. This is not just open space. This is not just parkland. You have, through every pore of your city, a great work of art, right? It doesn't mean that it can't be adapted to the needs of contemporary society. It doesn't mean that there may not need new forms of recreation or new needs of recreation, right? But do it carefully. Don't put a mustache on the Mona Lisa, right? Do it carefully, strategically, and surgically, right? And join together with your fellow fans of George, right? Kansas City, South Bend, Terre Haute, Cincinnati. There's strength in numbers. Thank you.